Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today I just learned that Ken Ham has his own YouTube channel that has different content than the official Answers in Genesis channel, so I poked around a bit and found this video of Ken and Bodie Hodge talking about ice ages and how they fit into the creationist worldview. So let's go! Would you look at them hiding in the shadows? You'd think that a guy who can afford to build a $100 million landlocked boat would be able to spare $50 for a work light or something.
Well, hi everyone, Bodie and Ken here at the Ark.
Back at it again, yeah.
Back at it again.
Yeah.
We promised people that we would look at a few more of the exhibits here associated with our, what we call the fifth Answers book.
That's right.
The Flood of Evidence.
Flood of Evidence.
Flood of Evidence. There it is.
Okay, why would you call it the fifth Answers book if it's called A Flood of Evidence? Couldn't you just have made it, the fifth Answers book if it is the fifth Answers book?
Actually, the Answers books, these Answers books 1, 2, 3, and 4, are the biggest selling creation apologetics books in the world.
And the answers found in them are so weak that they, at least sometimes, create atheists out of young Earth creationist believers, or at least start them down that path.
Now we'll talk about another chapter dealing with the Ice Age.
Yeah.
People often ask, do creationists believe in an Ice Age? Do you believe in an Ice Age?
Yeah, I do. I think there was an ice age. It was triggered by the flood of Noah's day.
I'm uncertain how a global event that would have left the Earth an uninhabitable molten ball could possibly have caused a period of global cooling sufficient to result in an ice age.
So you don't believe in Ice Ages?
That's correct. Now, see, that's one of the significant things. In the secular world, they have a multitude of ice ages that go back, ages and ages and ages. I don't know how far back they actually go in their worldview, but,
Well, firstly, let's just use proper terminology here. Technically speaking, any time when there is permanent ice on the planet is part of an ice age. What people are talking about colloquially when they mention an ice age are the glaciation periods, when sizable portions of the northern and southern hemisphere are covered by glaciers. So right now, because there is permanent ice at the poles of the Earth, we are in an ice age. But because the continents are not mostly covered with glaciers, we are in the interglacial period of that ice age. The non-ice age periods are known as greenhouse periods, where there are enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to prevent permanent ice from forming. The oldest ice age that we are aware of was about 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, during the Proterozoic. That particular ice age was possibly caused by the Great Oxidation Event, where photosynthesizing bacteria reach numbers great enough to remove large amounts of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, replacing them with oxygen. This resulted in a global cooling, which kicked off the ice age. And one of the ways we know about this ice age is from the presence of tillite deposits in rock layers from that time period, tillite being the deposition that results from the movement of glaciers. Also keep in mind, usually creationists will assert that the flood began where geologists have divided the rock layers between the Precambrian and the Cambrian, meaning that Precambrian rock is from before the flood. This ice age was Precambrian, meaning that a creationist would place it before the flood. Tillite is only formed by glaciers. There is tillite in Precambrian rock. Ergo, there was an ice age before the flood, which flies in the face of the usual creationist claim that the whole Earth was a tropical environment before the flood.
we do have one major ice age. Of course, there was advances and retreats and so forth, even with that ice age.
So what you seem to be saying there is that the typical geology model that has several ice ages separated by millions of years where there is no permanent ice on the planet, each of which also has several periods of glaciation and interglaciation, all represent advances and retreats of the one ice age that happened immediately after the flood for a couple hundred years? Here's the thing with that. Aside from the geologic evidence of ice ages found in layers that are before, during, and after where creationists like to put the flood, the Earth's orbit around the Sun is mostly circular, but it varies in eccentricity over time, eccentricity being a deviation from a perfect circle. There are also changes in the axial tilt and axial rotation. These three changes together are dubbed the Milankovitch cycles. These are all data that can be measured in the present, the creationist's favorite kind of data. And what's more, if we extrapolate these data back into the past, there is a correlation with the climate as measured in the geologic record. To oversimplify it, this means when the Earth's orbit brings it farther away from the Sun, that's when we see geologic records of ice ages. The dates for the ice ages were determined independently from the Milankovitch cycles. They didn't have to match up, but they did. What is the creationist explanation for this?
So one major ice age. So at the end of the flood, you've got warm water,
Correct.
cooler land.
How did you figure out that the land was cooler? According to John Baumgartner in his 1990 paper published in Creation Science Research Quarterly, a creationist research journal that refuses to publish anything unless it supports creationism, the same forces that are responsible for plate tectonics today would have to have been the same forces responsible during the flood, the main force being buoyancy. But in order to move the continents at a speed of 3 meters per hour using buoyancy forces, you would need to significantly heat everything up to a point where it would take 73 million years for significant cooling to occur. So cooling must have occurred 10 to the 4th times faster than it actually does. The whole point of that particular paper was to argue that creationists should be more comfortable with just popping in "God did it" as an excuse when science fails them, which, to his credit, is at least an honest admission. I'd rather creationists explain away their incompatibilities with modern science with a simple "God did it." That is, at least, a more honest route to take than the usual route of quote mining and cherry-picking that creation science usually relies on.
Correct.
Lots of ash in the atmosphere from volcanic eruptions.
That's right. And that's actually rare conditions, by the way.
Okay, so a bunch of volcanic ash in the atmosphere as a result of all the water that landed on the Earth. Well, I guess if you guys want several billion years worth of plate tectonics to happen over one single year, that would make the planet geologically unstable, so sure. Maybe there were a bunch of volcanoes erupting, creating a global ash layer that caused some cooling 4,000 years ago. Well, massive volcanic activity like that is pretty easy to detect in the geologic strata, so if the creationist timeline is correct, near the top layers should be a global layer of volcanic ash. That never quite happens, though. The largest volcanic eruption of the Quaternary period, that is, the time period that we are currently living in that goes back about 2.6 million years, is the Toba supereruption that happened 75,000 years ago. The ash from this eruption can be found all over the world, from the Greenland ice sheets to the marine sediment cores to volcanic tuff strata in Africa. This eruption has been dated using multiple methods, including visual stratigraphy and radiometrically, and all the dates come back to about 75,000 years. And this is just one volcano. There is zero evidence of any widespread volcanic activity in the last 4,000 years. And then Bodie brought up that these are rare conditions. My first question for him would be, how does he know they are rare conditions? In his worldview, the Earth hasn't even been around long enough to determine which conditions are rare and which ones are common in the long term. And secondly, let's remove the volcanoes from the equation and just go with the conditions that cause ice ages are rare conditions. That is a true statement. There have only really been 5 proper ice ages in the last 4.5 billion years of the history of the Earth, which have lasted for a combined total of about 547 million years, for a whopping 12% of Earth's history. So it appears that about 88% of the time, the conditions of the Earth are not conducive to ice ages. So yes, the conditions that cause ice ages are indeed rare.
Rare conditions, yes, so that causes a cooling effect, but because of the warm water you got evaporation, and so you would have a lot of precipitation in the form of snow.
A lot more snow in the
ice.
winter, yep.
Well, as the calculations published in the Creation Research Journal point out, it probably wouldn't have been cold enough for snow right after an event that would have superheated the Earth. So, no, this doesn't really fly.
And the build-up of an ice age.
That's right.
Within, a few hundred years of the flood?
That's right. See, there's this mistaken idea that if you just cool the globe, then you're going to get an ice age. No, you just get a cold globe. You don't get an ice age.
Right. He's kinda right. An ice age is not necessarily caused by the entire globe cooling down. It is specifically when the northern hemisphere gets less solar radiation, causing cooler summers for them, where the temperature stays below freezing for the whole summer in large areas. This then allows for an accumulation of annual snow ice, which then has a bit of a feedback loop going on that causes the Earth to get colder still, which causes more ice to accumulate over a wider area, gradually leading to an ice age.
So that's the key. If you can warm up, here, let's just use this background here. If you could warm up your oceans and get a lot more snow in, say, the winter time and even spring and so forth, so you got a lot there, and you have cooler summers, it doesn't all melt off. So you're left with some so that the next year it continues to build.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it works, but that would not have happened after the flood. The land would have been orders of magnitude hotter than it is, and all the tectonic activity happening during the flood would have flash-boiled the oceans, converting them all into steam with such force that it would have blown away our entire atmosphere, but yeah, would have snowed right after this event.
That's what this exhibit explains to people.
Yeah.
Warmer oceans at the start of the flood, massive fishes.
Now, why would there be warmer oceans?
Seafloor. Well,
because of the tectonic activity that would have released billions of Hiroshima bombs worth of energy every single day. That's why. That's also why there would have been warmer land masses, and warmer air. If any water did stay on the planet, it would have been steam, not snow. And that's just looking at the heat from tectonic activity and completely ignoring the kinetic energy of the rain hitting the Earth, which actually turns out to be rather negligible when looking at a disaster of this magnitude. It's a measly 32.6 billion Hiroshima bombs for the whole 40 days. But I was being conservative with that calculation. I started with the 85 kilograms of water per square meter per minute that I calculated in another video, which also assumes that 75% of the water for the flood came from the fountains of the deep, not from the sky. And I assumed that this water would only be falling from a height of 100 meters, which is ridiculously low. But really, what it comes down to is that we are looking at such a destructive release of energy on the planet that I can look at my result of 32.6 billion Hiroshima bombs and call it negligible.
Because the split up of the continents?
That's right. Yeah, the springs of the Great Deep burst forth. Yeah, the moving and motion of continental movement. That's going to heat everything up.
Damn straight it's going to heat everything up. Now take a moment to look at the calculations done by a creationist scientist and published in a creationist journal that demonstrate that the amount of heat needed would have cooked everything and left the Earth uninhabitable for millions of years, and tell me again that the science actually points to creationism.
Then you get cooler atmosphere.
That's correct. And why would it be cooler?
Good question. With all that tectonic activity going on at the surface, the main source of heat for the planet at this point would be the planet itself, not the sun. The sun hits us with a measly 237 million Hiroshima bombs per day. During the flood, the tectonic activity alone was billions of Hiroshima bombs per day. That far outstrips the sun, and that calculation was only for one coast of North America. It completely ignored any tectonic activity happening on the west coast, or in Europe, Asia, Africa, Oceania, and Antarctica. So throw a layer of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, which would have been stripped away, but let's pretend it somehow survived, and if anything, it will act as an insulator to keep all that heat generated by the tectonic activity on the Earth instead of radiating out into space.
Because of all the
volcanic ash.
The volcanic ash, which would actually make a nice little blanket to keep the Earth warm in the cold depths of outer space. It's quite cozy, really.
And you know, we've observed that even with more modern volcanoes, even back in the 1800s, big volcanoes have gone off. And what it does is it leaves particulates up in the upper atmosphere, some dioxins and things like that. And what that does, that actually reflects more of the sunlight back, and it actually cools the globe significantly.
Yes, everything Bodie just said is true. But unfortunately for them, the effect doesn't scale up quite as far as they want it to. I mean, under normal heavy volcanic activity, sure, the volcanoes don't provide enough heat to the Earth to outstrip the sun. But on the scales required for the flood, the sun becomes a secondary heat source for the Earth, so the ash layer would not have had the same cooling effect as it otherwise might.
Within 700 years of the flood, and then as things settle down, the ice age is going to recede, correct?
No, incorrect. There would not have been an ice age. But let's just take a moment to consider what Ken is talking about. 700 years of glacial maximum, starting just 4,368 years ago, according to AIG's website. And remember, they think the Tower of Babel is the story of how all the different languages developed, and that happened about 100 years after the flood. But somehow, in ancient Egypt, they transitioned from the 5th dynasty to the 6th dynasty before the Tower of Babel, and there were already several different written languages in existence at that time. The Egyptian vizier Ptahhotep somehow managed to write his book, The Maxims of Ptahhotep, before the flood, or during the flood. The possible date range for the writing is 2375 to 2350 BCE, and AIG places the flood at 2348 BCE. So this dude in Egypt was writing in Egyptian before languages other than Hebrew were invented. And let's not also forget that through archaeology, we can actually watch the development of Akkadian and Sumerian in the Mesopotamian region starting around 8000 BCE, with proper cuneiform writing showing up around 2500 BCE, over a century before the flood.
Yeah, and you know what? I know there's variations in models like this. So, you know, definitely within a matter of hundreds of years, we're going to get to a peak, and then we're going to see it begin to retreat.
Yeah, but there's no evidence of a glacial maximum at that time. That is just a fact. We have an unbroken dendrochronological record going back about 10,000 years. We've correlated the dendrochronological data with ice cores and marine sediment cores, and all signs point to the last glacial maximum having ended between 15 and 20,000 years ago. And these are using dating methods that are easy to cross-reference. Not only can we use carbon dating, but we can use visual stratigraphy, and while we don't have a completely unbroken dendrochronological record going back that far, the ice cores and marine sediment cores certainly do. Using multiple dating methods, there has been no evidence found of a glacial maximum in the last 10,000 years, and yet there were supposedly several hundred years worth of ice age that have gone completely undetected just 4,000 years ago. Oh yeah, also worth mentioning is the fact that there are several living organisms that would have lived through this flood that was supposed to kill everything, such as the bristlecone pines, the clonal pando forest, and the Norway spruces, a 10,000-year-old colony of seagrass in the Mediterranean, the Jurupa oak colony in California, a 13,000-year-old huckleberry bush in Pennsylvania, glass sponges that are more than 10,000 years old, and more.
Didn't God promise Noah after the flood that seasons would continue?
That's right. That's Genesis 8:22.
Day and night continue. So we don't have to worry about that ceasing to happen.
That's right. So long as the earth endures, that's not going to cease. So we don't have to worry about it, being a catastrophic climate change.
Wow, that is something else. I don't think I've ever heard any climate scientist claim that climate change would cause the seasons or the day-night cycle of the Earth to stop. The Earth will still be tilted no matter what we do to it, and it'll still rotate, although over time it will rotate slower and slower. But if all the ice melts, all of Florida will be underwater. That might not be so catastrophic to me, sitting at a decently high elevation. I'm 184 meters above sea level, and if all the ice melted, seas would rise about 70 meters, so I am comfortably outside of the error bars there. But I don't think that the people that live right on the coast would consider a 70-meter rise in sea level to be not catastrophic. And yes, no matter what humans do, not all of the ice caps will melt within our lifetime, but sea levels have been steadily rising since the Industrial Revolution. They rose by about 21 to 24 centimeters since 1880, which doesn't seem like much, but the rate is accelerating. A third of the sea level rise came in the last 25 years, so that's 33% of the sea level rise occurring in the most recent 18% of the time we've been measuring. Higher sea levels combined with warmer water results in more severe weather systems, which is something we're already seeing. Hurricanes are not more frequent than before, but more of them reach Category 5 and they last longer and make their way further inland. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey dropped so much rain that the National Weather Service had to add 2 more shades of purple to the rainfall maps to account for it. Nuisance flooding, which is flooding that is not deadly or dangerous but can still cause significant damage, is happening 300 to 900% more frequently than it was 50 years ago. These trends are undeniable. The climate is changing, and it is doing so in a way that, maybe it's not as catastrophic as Noah's flood would have been, but best case scenario will cause mass migrations, ecosystem destruction, and expensive structural damage.
When you actually do some research, you find out, didn't they used to believe that the Sahara Desert was very fertile once?
Well, that's right. In fact, as you start looking underneath a lot of that sand, and they see evidence of, forests and things like that.
Yes, the Sahara was once a lush, fertile forest. Fun fact, it's actually on a cycle where it alternates between being a desert and being a forest. Another fun fact, these cycles correspond with Milankovitch cycles. So now we have 2 data points that correspond with changes in our orbit projected into the past, and they match up perfectly. The flood does not match up. It's fun how when you use real data, you can find trends and patterns like this.
But wait a minute, today we have the secularists blaming humans and cars and coal-fired power stations and so on for climate change, and yet there must have been some drastic climate change in the past when we didn't have cars and coal-fired power stations.
Yes, there have been periods of drastic climate change in the past. Usually not as drastic as what we are causing now, but still quite drastic. And do you know what happens to life on the planet when the climate changes drastically? A good chunk of it dies off. This logic amounts to bad things happen naturally, so humans causing these bad things to happen artificially shouldn't be a problem.
That's right. Well, after the flood, because of all this extra precipitation, the world should have been fairly lush. Mm-hmm. And then you have the ice age, it triggers everything.
So which is it? Was it lush and green right after all the plants were killed off and the soil salted, or was it an ice age? Make up your mind.
But that's constantly changing, and we see evidence of that even in Scripture. Think of Abraham. Abraham went down to Egypt. Why? Because of a massive famine. Mm-hmm. We saw the same sort of thing, in Joseph's day, where a famine that went for, about 7 years or so.
Famines can happen naturally, so if humans cause one, that's okay. nobody is saying that the climate has been perfectly stable with what humans have seen over the past few thousand years. Therefore, when the climate changes, that's some bad thing that we have to stop. No, we look at the record. We see that the climate has changed in the past. We see that usually these climate changes result in mass extinctions. Then we see that we are changing the climate faster than it usually changes in nature, and hopefully we decide to do something to mitigate that. Long term, the Earth will probably be uninhabitable to humans in about 1 billion years, when the increased brightness of the sun will cause the oceans to evaporate, causing a runaway greenhouse effect that could raise the surface temperatures to 70 to 100 degrees Celsius. There's nothing we puny humans can do to stop that. But that doesn't mean that we should do our best to fuck up the climate that we happen to have now. Also, another fun fact, if we were to completely transition to green infrastructure, it would cost less than what the healthcare costs of dealing with the results of air pollution are. In other words, in the long term, it's cheaper to go green even if you don't think climate change is a thing.
Think of their history, their timeline. They're assuming things are uniform, and that's called uniformitarianism back in the past. So they're assuming that all along here, the temperatures really haven't changed much, really hasn't changed. Now they see slight fluctuations, and they're like, oh no, what'd we do?
Where are you getting that information from? I don't know of any climate scientist who is convinced that the climate of the Earth was identical to the climate we have now for the entire history of the Earth. And you know this because you know that we are aware of several ice ages in Earth's history. And it wasn't the creationists who found out about the cycles of the Sahara Desert. It was the scientists that you are accusing of pretending that the climate of the Earth has been stable this entire time.
Suddenly, the younger generation, they don't realize that there have been times in the past when there's been bigger hurricanes.
In the last century, we have had an average of 0.35 Category 5 Atlantic hurricanes per year. Since 1990, we've had an average of 0.5 Cat 5 hurricanes per year in comparison with the 0.3 Cat 5s per year before that. Did Category 5 hurricanes start because of human-driven climate change? No, but their frequency is certainly increasing, with us getting an average of 1 every 2 years now instead of the 1 every 3 years for the 70 years before 1990.
That's right.
It just depends on where they hit, and now we have a lot more population, and so population centers.
Right,
can flood,
we may see a lot more damage,
Right.
because we have a lot more stuff built nowadays.
Right. And
Also because they are traveling further inland and lasting longer thanks to the warmer oceans. Just look at the list of hurricanes that managed to make landfall in Canada. It happened 8 times in 50 years, from 1900 to 1949. From 1950 to 1994, it happened 21 times. From 1995 to today, 26 times. In the last 26 years, hurricanes kept up enough steam to make landfall as far north as Canada 26 times. That's 3.25 times as many as managed it in the first 50 years of the 20th century. So hurricanes are, on average, getting stronger and lasting longer. But yeah, all the additional damage is because we built more stuff for them to damage. It has nothing to do with the fact that the ocean temperatures have been on a steady increase over the last century.
hey, during the Ice Age, ocean levels would have been lowered.
That's exactly right.
When we had a glacial maximum,
Yep.
and there would have been land bridges in various places.
Yes, one hypothesis about the origin of humans on the American continents is that there was a land bridge across the Bering Strait during the last glacial maximum, some 20,000 years ago. Which brings to mind another question. How did these populations of people living in the Americas survive the global flood? Certainly there wasn't time for them to move over there after the flood. They would have had to migrate on foot from the Middle East, across Asia, then over the land bridge spreading south down to South America, establishing dozens of entire civilizations and cultures and languages along the way, and then immediately set to building the Mesoamerican pyramids that were constructed a mere 1,300 years after the flood. Now, it's definitely doable for a person to make that journey in the time allotted, but these people are founding cultures everywhere they go, cultures with rich histories, not trekking purposefully in the right direction. There's just not enough time to get all of the people groups that you see in the world in just a couple thousand years.
And what that does is that actually lowers your ocean level, and that exposes land bridges. This is probably the famous one between Russia and Alaska, but you could potentially have gone all the way out to places like Cuba.
And that could enable animals and people to actually
be able to
move to
fill
other
different
places.
parts of the Earth fairly quick, yeah.
Yeah, and somehow the animals did it in a way that was entirely consistent with the locations that they came from. All the sloths went back to South America without stopping anywhere. The vast majority of marsupial animals went back to Australia without stopping. The panda went to Asia and just settled in there. And actually, you guys using the Bering Strait for your point makes it even worse. You see, in a previous video, I had done some calculations on how long it would take a sloth to make it back to South America if they walked directly from Mount Ararat to Brazil in a straight line, ignoring the Atlantic Ocean. But here, you guys are claiming that the animals would have gone through Asia and come at the Americas from the north. Not only is that a much longer journey, but you expect me to believe that all of the tropical animals that need lush, green, warm environments to survive migrated to South America over a land bridge in the Arctic during an ice age. That doesn't strike you as being implausible at all?
So as we go around here, this is an interesting one here, the Lost Squadron.
Yeah. Well, you talked about this in the Can't Hand Bill 9 debate.
I love the Lost Squadron. I think my video on ice core dating that deals with the Lost Squadron was one of the videos I had the most fun putting together. I think it's probably because it's a claim that doesn't come up all that often, so when I first ran into it, it was like a breath of fresh air. Finally, a new argument for me to tackle. I mean, obviously it's not an entirely new argument, it was just new to me at the time.
That came up in the Bill Nye debate,
Yeah.
That's true. In 1942, 6 P-38 fighter planes and 2 B-17 bombers were forced to land on the ice in Greenland. They basically ran out of fuel.
Yeah, they ran out of fuel.
And they were abandoned. 40 years later, they had a search to try to find them.
It's a bit hard to hear them in the environment that they're in, so let me just summarize what they're saying. The planes were not laterally where they should have been. They moved because they landed on an active glacier, which carried them away. They were also buried under about 80 meters of snow.
Yeah.
There's a model we have here explaining that. 250 feet down in the
Now, this
ice.
isn't 250 layers of ice. This is 250 feet of layers.
Excellent distinction, Bodie. Well done! You see, one of the common tactics that creationists will use when bringing up the Lost Squadron is to be discussing ice layers when setting up the scenario, and then transitioning into a depth measurement, whether it be feet or meters, without acknowledging the transition. This is important because there are a number of factors at play here. The relationship between depth and age is not a constant. You need to account for the local topography and weather conditions. The Lost Squadron landed near the coast, where Greenland gets pummeled with quite a bit of snow every year, about 2 meters per year. Greenland's interior, which is where the stable ice fields that we collect ice cores from, get about 0.3 meters of snowfall per year. There's also the case of the Neptune P-2V that crashed not far from where the Lost Squadron was lost, but it was far enough away that the local weather conditions differed enough that it was still visible on the surface decades after the crash. Because, you see, local weather conditions are important things to take into account when doing calculations like this. It's interesting how creationists always complain about scientists assuming uniformitarianism, but then they work under the assumption that the coast of Greenland has similar enough weather to the interior that they can use it as evidence that data from the ice cores in the interior are inaccurate.
50 feet. These bombers landed in 1942, right?
Correct.
And then they found those bombers
About 40 years later.
years later. So you're talking in the 1980s. Wait a minute. Doesn't it take millions of years for all that ice to accumulate, Bodie?
No, Ken, it doesn't take millions of years for the ice layers to accumulate, and nobody has ever said that. It does take hundreds of thousands of years for the layers of the ice cores we collect from Greenland's interiors to form. And yes, we do have ice on the planet that is a couple million years old, but that's about the upper limit. Also worth mentioning is that we don't just look at ice cores in isolation. We also coordinate them with marine sediment cores and dendrochronological records. There are certain events that have distinct chemical signatures, a volcanic eruption for instance. Each eruption is unique in its chemical makeup. So when we find a volcanic ash layer in an ice core and it shares its chemistry with volcanic ash layer in a marine sediment core, then we know that both of those layers were formed at the same time. And on top of that, ice cores are some of the most thoroughly dated samples that we have. It's not unheard of for a single ice core to have more than 40 independent dating methods used on it. And somehow, all of these completely independent methods agree with each other despite being wrong, I guess.
Well, that's what we're taught there. We're taught that each one of these little bitty layers in here, each one is an annual layer, as if, every March 1st it starts a new layer or something.
No, the layers form because warmer weather partially melts the ice, then there is snow accumulation on top of the partially melted ice, and then the colder weather comes along and refreezes it. The partially melted portions are more translucent than the accumulation that happens during the winter, which stays frozen. So it is actually possible to form more than one layer per year, but when that happens, the layers don't look quite the same, and the scientists are able to pick them out. In fact, in some of the younger layers, it's entirely possible to see individual weather systems within the layers leaving traces, so they can tell you that a storm happened in the early spring for layer X and whatnot. Also, it bears mentioning that I have never been able to find any record of ice cores being taken from the Lost Squadron site, nor does it appear that anyone called in a scientist specializing in ice core stratigraphy to examine the layers. So everything Bodie tells you about how many layers there are and what it should represent to a non-creationist scientist is pure speculation.
We actually have Bill Nye here on video because the Bill Nye debate was video,
too, didn't he?
And he came to the Ark, and so we have Bill Nye here, and I talk about that particular topic and explain this, that ice can be laid down very, very quickly.
What was his response? How did he respond to that sort of thing? Was he
always ignores the evidence.
Does he, though?
What, if anything, would ever change your mind?
As Christians, we can say we know. And so, as far as the Word of God is concerned, no. No one's ever going to convince me that the Word of God is not true. I would ask Bill the question, what would change your mind?
We would just need one piece of evidence. We would need the fossil that swam from one layer to another. We would need evidence that the universe is not expanding. We would need evidence that the stars appear to be far away, but they're not. We would need evidence that rock layers can somehow form in just 4,000 years instead of the extraordinary amount. We would need evidence that somehow you can reset atomic clocks and keep neutrons from becoming protons. You bring on any of those things and you would change me immediately.
Sounds like one of the two of you is open to new evidence, while the other one already has his mind made up. I wonder which of those two would be more likely to ignore evidence that doesn't line up with what they already think.
Because he'd accuse me of ignoring the evidence, but I'm saying no, we don't, because the evidence actually confirms what the Bible says.
It only confirms what the Bible says when you ignore huge chunks of evidence and twist, mangle, and distort the rest of them. In this video, which of us brought up data to account for the different weather patterns that you can see on Greenland? Which of us actually went to the trouble of finding out just how much heat would be generated by the tectonic activity that you propose? Which of us looked at the actual climate data that shows that humans are having a warming effect on the climate, and data about the results of that warning, and which of us brushed all the data aside with an appeal to, we built more stuff, so of course more stuff gets damaged? You have made a career out of cherry-picking and misrepresenting the evidence, and somehow you can stand there and say with a straight face that it's the scientists who are doing that, not you. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Marconius, who says, I'm always confused by creationists like this. Like, do they think that dumb scientists just don't notice these really obvious problems and only their God-enlightened brains could pierce through the veil? Or is it like Flat Earth and they think there's some kind of global conspiracy to hide the truth of the magic global flood? Well, in my experience, it looks like a bizarre mixture of both. I think the idea is that scientists want evolution to be true, so if they ever come across data that would render evolution an impossibility, they then twist their interpretation of that data in order to make it fit the evolutionist worldview, and only creation scientists are interpreting the data correctly. It just doesn't really fit, though, because the interpretation of the data is so harmonious across completely different scientific fields. Geology, paleontology, archaeology, astronomy, molecular biology, genomics, cosmology, and more all point to millions of years and evolution. But creationists can regularly be found ignoring the vast majority of the data of any particular field when developing their hypotheses, and on top of that, their own hypotheses are often incompatible with other hypotheses of theirs, meaning they have to compartmentalize their hypotheses and make sure they aren't presented close enough together to make those incongruencies obvious. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the snow that allows the ice layers that make up my channel to form. If you'd like to bury airplanes in me, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time! geology, paleontology, archaeology, astronomy, molecular biology.